I'm Dr. Robin DiAngelo, and my work focuses on the question of what does it mean to be white in a society that proclaims race meaningless, yet is profoundly separated by race. And to start this off, I want to draw your attention to the fact that I'm white. So just look at me for a moment, think about it, notice it. And part of being white is that it's a very uncomfortable thing for me to do. And it's taken me many, many years to be able to draw people's attention to my race and see any significance in it. And that's because as a white person, I was socialized to see race as what they had. I was just a person. I was just a white bread, a Heinz 57. I didn't have race. I was socialized to see race as individual acts of discrimination and prejudice, individual acts that anybody could do to anybody else, and if you did those acts, you were a bad person. And that is why, since I saw myself as a good person, I didn't see myself as connected to racism, and certainly didn't see myself as connected to race. In other words, I didn't have a sense of a racial identity. Today I understand that I move through the world always and most particularly as a white person. I have a white frame of reference and I have a white experience. And part of being white is to have that be invisible to us and to be able to live our lives without ever acknowledging that, to see that as non-operative. I now understand racism as a system, as a deeply embedded system, a system that our country was founded on and that all our institutions were created out of. And every institution reinforces this system. And it's a system of unequal power. So let me give you an example. Women in the United States got the right to vote in 1920. And there was only one possible way that we could have gotten the right to vote, and that was for men to give it to us, because we literally were not sitting in the seats of institutional power. We could not give ourselves the right to vote. That doesn't mean that we couldn't have personal power, but we didn't have institutional power. And that's the difference between a system and individual acts. Prior to women's suffrage, I could certainly discriminate against men, I could be unfair to individual men, but my group could not systematically deny men as a group the right to vote. And men controlled all the institutions, and they all worked together to convey the message that women's place was here and men's place was there. And that's the difference between individual prejudice and a system of inequality. So in this field, we think about oppression, or in this case racism, as group prejudice backed by institutional power.
Hi everyone, I'm Jacqueline Luqman, and this is Brick by Brick. So tonight we are on the second episode of a pretty intense journey, I think. We're talking about racism here in Brick by Brick, but we're not talking about it from the typical standpoint, because I think we really need to focus on what racism is and what it isn't from the standpoint of reality. Not just the reality of history, which you all know I love very much, but also from the reality of the way people perceive racism, what they think racism is, and what racism really is in the real world, what it really looks like. So tonight, I'm going to focus on something that Robin DiAngelo spoke about, the concept of privilege and white privilege. And I know it's something that a lot of white people have a difficult time accepting, because there are so many white people in this country who are poor. There are so many white people in this country who are disenfranchised, who are struggling, who are being oppressed, and who are being taken advantage of by the government too. But the key to understanding what white privilege really does mean, and understanding why most white people in this country really do experience it, really do have it, really do benefit from white privilege, is to understand what we're really talking about when we use certain words. So the very first thing I'm going to do is define some terms, okay? So let's define what racism is. Racism is prejudice, discrimination, antagonism directed against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior. Or it's the belief that all members of each race possess characteristics or abilities specific to that race, especially so as to distinguish it as inferior or superior to another race or races. Or it's the belief that race is the primary determinant of human traits and capabilities, and that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race. Racism is also racial prejudice or discrimination. Now, what do you notice about 3 out of the 4 of those definitions? Let me put them up on the screen again so you can see. The first definition: race, antagonism against someone of a different race based on the belief that one's own race is superior. Characteristics or abilities specific to that race, especially so as to distinguish it as inferior or superior to another race. Or how about human traits and capabilities that racial differences produce an inherent superiority of a particular race? Now, those definitions were actually pulled from 4 different sources. I didn't use just one source for the definitions of racism. And I intentionally included more than one definition because it's a word that people argue about all the time: what racism is, what racism isn't. Well, in each of the 3 major definitions, there is one commonality. And that is the idea that people believe that their race is superior to another race that they don't like. That's the common thread in every definition of racism that exists that really matters. But the 4th definition is very interesting, and I intentionally included that as well. Let's go back and look at that. Racial prejudice or discrimination. Well, of course, now we have to define what those 2 terms are: prejudice and discrimination. Prejudice is injury or damage resulting from some judgment or action of another in disregard of one's rights, especially becoming a detriment to one's legal rights or claims. Prejudice is also an irrational attitude of hostility directed against an individual, a group, a race, or their supposed characteristics. And discrimination is the unjust or prejudicial treatment of different categories of people or things, especially on the grounds of race, age, or sex. But let me look at prejudice, and let's examine that a little bit more closely. Prejudice is injury or damage resulting from some judgment or action of another in disregard of one's rights, especially being a detriment to one's legal rights or claims. Very frequently, when Black people talk about racism and the racism we experience in this country still today, what we hear a lot from white people is that, well, racism goes both ways. Black people can be racist too. Well, that's actually not true if the definition of racism includes the feeling of superiority over another race of people. Because generally, Black people, when we are advocating for ourselves, when we are fighting against racism, we're not fighting for our superiority as Black people over white people. We're fighting for our humanity to be recognized. We're fighting for equality. We're fighting for equity. We're fighting for justice. We're fighting for equal protection under the law. What we're not fighting for when we are talking about fighting against racism is the declaration of the superiority of black people over white people. So, no, in that way, black people cannot be racists. And I know that's a very difficult concept for many white people to grasp. And it's because of the definition of prejudice that people confuse with racism or racist. So certainly black people can hate white people. Absolutely true. And full disclosure here. My mom integrated her high school, and I've told you that story several times before. But what I didn't tell you about my mom was that she was so traumatized by the experience that she endured integrating her high school that for a very long time my mother did not like white people. And that was very interesting because my mother worked for a government agency. I was about to name it, but I realized I shouldn't do that. But my mother did not trust white people. She did not like white people. She had had a lifetime of harrowing, awful, violent experiences with white people. Did she come across some who were not racists against her, who were not hateful toward her and her family? Yes, she did. But in our small town, at that time, when my mother was in the 10th grade, those white people, those well-meaning white people, 90 miles south of Richmond, were few and far between. So yes, black people can hate white people. That's entirely possible. Black people can be prejudiced. They can hold an irrational attitude of hostility. And I would even argue with the use of the term irrational in this definition of prejudice, because someone like my mother, who grew up with a lifetime of racial hatred and violence directed at her and her family, feelings of mistrust or not liking white people, that's not irrational. That's based on experience. But let's stick with the definition as it is. Yes, black people can be prejudiced. Black people can have a bias against white people. But the difference between prejudice and racist is that with racism, there has to be an impact that affects an entire group of people, that affects infringing upon someone's rights, that affects someone's legal claims. And black people just aren't in a position of power to be able to do that. Maybe to one white person, perhaps to 5, but to an entire nation of white people, we don't have that power. So when we're talking about the difference between racism and prejudice, when black people talk about fighting against racism, we're talking about the structural, historical impact of racist attitudes toward an entire nation of black people, 43 million of us. I think that's the accurate, close to accurate number. If I'm not correct on that, I know you guys will correct me. So when we're talking about the difference between racism and prejudice, yes, you have to ask yourself, what impact does a black person have hating white people? As opposed to what impact does a white person who hates black people have on most black people? The impact is very different historically. So this is why comments that we hear from white people when we talk about fighting racism, and when black people say, no, black people really cannot be racist in the context that we are talking about racism. Sure, we can be prejudiced. Absolutely, we can be biased. But can we really discriminate and be prejudiced to the point where we affect the legal rights of an entire group of white people? No. So this is why when white people respond with comments like, well, reverse racism exists. I was discriminated against by black people. I've experienced reverse racism. Racism goes both ways. Black people can be racist. They're not valid responses because they are not rooted in the reality of what racism is, of what prejudice is, and what the difference between the two are when we're talking about institutional, systematic, and historical, legislated, race-based bias directed at a group of people. Black people have never had the power to direct that. And I know that very frequently, white people who mean very well, they don't mean, I think some white people honestly don't mean to be this flippant. But when we get to that point in the conversation and white people say, well, what about people like Oprah Winfrey? What about people like President Obama? We had a black president. What about all of these black CEOs? Black people have power too. You have to understand who really holds and wields the power in this country. And I could really think of only one way to do that, and that's to give you some statistics. So that's what I'm going to do right now. And we're going to go through these, and I'm going to explain to you, I'm going to try very hard to show you why black people in America do not have the power in the context of any major influential institution to be racist against white people. Here's the first slide. In the legal system, I'm sorry, these are going a little fast. Public school teachers, 11% black. Private school, this is supposed to be private, 10% black. I think I'm going to have to do that again. I am. There we go. In business, Fortune 500 CEOs, only 1% black. 5,000, 1.5% black. Only 9.5% small business ownership. Congressmen, only 43 black congressmen. Only 3 black senators. No black governors. 10% police officers nationally. 4.3% FBI agents. I apologize that these are going as fast as they are. I didn't mean for them to. Only 11% federal court judges, 4% elected prosecutors. Public school teachers, 11%. Public school principals, 11%. Let me see if I can go back to that slide. I thought I timed these so well, but I guess I didn't. Only 9.5% black people are own small businesses. 3.2% of the mayors are black in this country. No black governors. 24% of the workforce of the CIA and 10% of the senior management are minorities, but there's no racial breakdown. 11% of the federal court judges are black. 4% of the elected state prosecutors are black. Private school teachers, 4%. Private school principals, 7%. With those kinds of statistics, there are not enough black people in positions of real, authentic, meaningful, impactful power in this country to perpetuate racism against white people. We are simply not in positions of power to affect those kinds of changes, to effect that kind of damage against white people, a majority population in this country. And when you think about those statistics, and yes, I will provide that slide deck for you so that you can take your time and walk through them, and I'll provide you the sources that all of the information comes from. Maybe I hope it's a little bit more clear to you why we haven't advanced farther than we have in regard to equality and justice in this nation. Because the people who hold the power continue to uphold and perpetuate a system that promotes racist laws, policies, and practices. And every institution in this country upholds that system. So the idea of reverse racism existing, the idea that black people can be racists, the idea that black people can discriminate against white people as a whole, those are not valid responses to our discussions about racism. Those aren't valid responses to our charges of racism when we point out the racism that we endure, that we all need to fight and dismantle. On another note about reverse racism, black people who don't like white people, and again, I said black people can be prejudiced and we can be bigoted, some of us, but black people who don't like white people generally don't like white people because they think we're superior to white people. Again, black people who are mistrustful and don't like white people feel that way, usually because of a history of behavior that they've experienced from white people against everyone who isn't identified as white in this country and around the world. And very often it's based on much of their own experiences with direct racism that they have encountered. And I am not talking about personal one-on-one individual prejudice of a white person against a black people, a black person. I am talking about a white person in a position of authority to be able to make a decision that negatively impacts that black person's life. Like not being approved for a mortgage when you know you have the credit and the income to qualify. Like not being shown houses that you can afford in neighborhoods that you want to live in, even though you know you can afford the house. Like not being approved for an auto loan at a rate that you know you qualify for. Like not having your child admitted to a private school that you want your child to attend. Like not being afraid for your life when you're stopped by a police officer at any given time for any given reason, anywhere in this country. So back to Robin DiAngelo's video. She talked about white privilege. And that is a flashpoint phrase. I've seen a lot of conversations from people basically disavowing the idea that privilege exists. And again, it's because people misconstrue the definition of the word privilege. But that's kind of interesting because when I actually looked up the word privilege, it doesn't even mean what I thought people thought it meant. So let's look at the word privilege. Privilege is a special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group of people. I'm going to leave this up here for just a couple of seconds. Let's break this down. Because, see, I thought that privilege, one of the definitions of privilege, meant that people are materially privileged, that they're wealthy, that they have more than other people, that they have access to more stuff than other people, right? You probably thought that too, some of you. But that's not what the word means at all. It is literally a special right, advantage, or immunity granted or available only to a particular person or group of people. Why is this so important in this discussion of racism? Because very frequently, a lot of white people will respond to black people saying, you have to check your white privilege with, well, I can't be privileged, I'm poor. I can't have white privilege, I grew up poor. My family grew up poor. I come from a generation of poor people. I come from a long line of poor, downtrodden white people in Appalachia. And this is very true, as I said in the beginning, for many white people in this country. But because we don't know the actual definition of the word privilege, we believe, many people believe, that we're talking about something other than what we really mean. And that is that white people in this country have a special right, an advantage, or immunity granted or available only to white people that black people do not have, or Native Americans, or Latinos, or LGBTQ people. The list can, but we're talking about racism. So what does this mean that white people, even poor white people, have a special right or advantage or an immunity granted? For me, that is the key phrase, that white people have an immunity granted or available to them that other people don't have. Well, that's because the laws that were passed that disproportionately affected black people, and still do, did not affect white people. Not as much. Most of the laws that we are still feeling the effects from, even though many of them have been repealed, like Jim Crow laws, fugitive slave laws, the papers laws that were in effect around the country. What were the papers laws? Well, if you were black, you had to make sure that you had your freedom papers on you to prove that you were free, so that you could not be mistaken for a slave and sent back into captivity or enslavement. But that didn't even matter, because many free blacks were kidnapped and sent back down south to slavery. But black codes, pig laws, convict leasing laws, Jim Crow, redlining, school segregation, union exclusion, Social Security exclusion of farm and domestic workers that people keep saying wasn't directed at black people, even though over 60% of farm and domestic workers who were excluded from Social Security benefits were African Americans. Judicial bias, persistent police brutality, and the efforts to excuse, cover up, and exonerate police officers who violate the rights of a disproportionate percentage of black and brown people in this country. Those laws, those practices, those policies, and along with the issues that I brought up earlier, the discrimination in housing and finance and even in healthcare and education, those policies were not directed at white people. That's your immunity. That is your privilege. And I know that is a very difficult thing to sit with as you sit in your kitchen and you struggle to pay your bills, just like we do. I know that is not something that is easy for you to understand and accept, that you have a privilege that other poor people don't have. As you wonder how you're going to pay for your child's school supplies and feed your kids and pay the rent and fix your car that you need to get back and forth to work. I understand that the idea that you have a privilege because you are white is difficult for you to accept because of the economic conditions you live in. But the fact of the matter is, there are laws that are still being enforced. There are policies that are still being implemented and carried out. There are practices and stereotypes that are still being adhered to, that are directed toward Black people. They're not directed toward you. And although you may experience a degree of discrimination because people might look at you as poor white trash, there is a separate, legalized, codified, socially acceptable weaponization of racial discrimination, animosity, and hatred that white people are immune from. This is not saying you don't have struggles. White privilege is saying that you don't have these particular struggles that were specifically designed for Black people. So really, when white people respond by saying, I don't have white privilege because I was born poor, that they're really rejecting the word privilege and their misunderstanding of what it really means. And as I thought about this conversation tonight, I had some really interesting epiphanies. I thought they were interesting anyway, so I figure I'll share them with you. I think it's ironic that people who argue that there's more than one definition of racism, right? Because you've heard this. White people who reject the idea that Black people can't be racist. And they come with this definition of racism that excludes the power dynamic, excludes the superiority of another race factor. They reject the idea that there's more than one definition of racism to try to prove that Black people can indeed be racists. But they also reject the idea that their definition of privilege is not accurate. So they can't be convinced that what they think privilege means doesn't really mean what they think it means. I find that very ironic that some of the same people who will find 87 definitions of racism to prove that Black people can be racists won't listen to what the definition of privilege really means, because it directly challenges their idea that they don't have white privilege. That is an example of cognitive dissonance. The holding on to a belief so strongly that when you're presented with evidence that your belief is wrong, you can't pay attention to it. It's just not there. It's off there on the side, and you're just not going to pay any attention to it. And you continue to hold fast to this incorrect belief, regardless of how much evidence is presented that proves it wrong. And unfortunately, the only thing you can do with people who exhibit that kind of attitude is leave the evidence with them and go on about your way. Another response that I hear from some white people, and this goes right along with the black people can be racists, is that black privilege exists. It's the inverse. It's the opposite of the white privilege they don't have. And they say that, well, look, black privilege is a thing. Black people can be privileged because rich black people have privilege that I don't. Again, we can go back to that list of black people in positions of power, the percentage of black people in positions of power in this country. And that ought to prove to you that black people, as rich as some of us might be, don't actually have any power that affords us immunity from racism. Again, the idea that black privilege is based on material wealth, access to more stuff, is the basis for this false idea that black privilege exists. Wealthy black people don't have privilege that keeps them from experiencing racism. But if you want more resources, I will absolutely provide you with plenty of examples of wealthy, well-to-do, and even influential black people talking about the racism they still experience, even with all of their money, even with all of their influence. Like, there was a man, he was an attorney, and he was actually featured on a television show a while ago, and he talked about how he taught his children, a black man, taught his black children not to dress in a way that would invite criticism, racial criticism. So his son couldn't wear hoodies. His children couldn't wear tennis shoes. They couldn't wear jeans. The son always had to wear a button-down shirt or a polo shirt or khakis. His children went to exclusive, prestigious, private and charter, private school, and they didn't talk about race at all. And he believed that if he brought his children up that way, thinking that because they had money and that they traveled in circles of wealthy and powerful white people, that they were insulated from racism. He believed that until the day his son was called a nigger walking to class by some white kids who didn't know that child from Adam. What a harsh way to learn that your money doesn't insulate you from racism in America. That in America, people don't see wealthy black people as worthy of more respect or as deserving of their wealth as wealthy white people. No, to some white people, wealthy black people are simply exactly what they called that kid that day. I'll provide you with that article. Also, the article about Oprah Winfrey being told she can't afford a designer bag in some store in a foreign country. She's Oprah Winfrey, but she's also black. I'll provide you the story of Henry Louis Gates, who was arrested on the doorstep of his own home at Harvard University. I'm sure he didn't move in the day before, so how his neighbor could not have known that he was trying to get into his own house beyond me, other than the fact that I know that Professor Henry Louis Gates is black. I'll give you the story of the Major League Baseball player who's retired, who was approached by the police because a neighbor called the police on a black man shoveling snow in the driveway. He was shoveling snow in the driveway of his own home. I'll provide you with as many resources as I possibly can to give you as much evidence as you could possibly need to understand that black privilege is not a thing. Wealthy black people have no more insulation from racism in this country than the poorest black person does. The only thing wealthy black people can use their money for is a really good attorney. So I've provided you with quite a bit of information, and I have intentionally not kept these episodes long because these are discussions that are very, very full of very, very difficult information to digest. And I don't want to overburden people with a bunch of history all of the time, as much as I love it, as much as it's relevant. But sometimes I just need to hit you with the facts and leave you with them. I will leave you with another ironic epiphany that I think I had. Very frequently, we hear white people say that the fight against racism isn't really a fight against racism, it's really about class. And I'll talk more about that in the next episode because I think that warrants a really deep examination into why that's not true. Aside from wealthy black people not having black privilege, there is the reality of specific laws that were created to disenfranchise all black people, regardless of income level in this country, that we are still living with the effects of. And one of those ways that we're still living with those effects is that, if you've noticed, wealthy white people seem to be able to move away from even wealthy black people into segregated neighborhoods. Now, frequently, when wealthy black people live in segregated neighborhoods, people assume that, well, listen, people want to live around people who are like them. And they just run with that response. But have you ever noticed that few people say the same thing about white people who live in segregated neighborhoods? Not out loud. Not in mixed company, as my grandmother called it. Because the fact of the matter is, wealthy white people are able to move anywhere they want to in this country without much or any resistance, any barriers, any hindrance, because of their privilege. Not necessarily because of their money, but because of their white privilege. So this is a phenomenon that we see in the Washington, D.C. area. The traffic is so terrible because white people have moved out of the city farther away into the suburbs, quite literally because they do not want to live around black people. But now that the commute has gotten unbearable, now white people are moving back into the cities and are displacing many of the black people who live in cities. And now the flight is reversed. But black people don't have that kind of power. You see, when white people move into black neighborhoods, black people move because we can no longer afford to live there because the property values mysteriously go up. It's not because black people don't take care of our property. It's not because all black neighborhoods are crime-ridden. It really, literally is because of the inherent racism in the housing market in America that values white homeowners more than it values black homeowners. But when a black person who has the means to move into an exclusive community, more likely than not, that black person will either not be welcome or they won't even be shown the property. They'll be shown a nice neighborhood where people like you will be more comfortable. I have black friends who are quite wealthy who have been told that several times. So I hope some of this information has been helpful to you. And I hope that you share it. I hope that you review it. I hope that you take this conversation in the spirit that I'm offering it. I'm trying very hard to have the dialogue that Black people are so often accused of not wanting to have. And it's not that we don't want to have the dialogue. We've been having this dialogue with white America for 400 years. But perhaps if I talk about this subject from the perspective of what we get wrong, what white people get wrong when they respond to our cries, our demands, our outrage at persistent racism in this country, if I can try to get some white people to understand where you go wrong in understanding what we mean, maybe we can get a little farther for the next generation. So thank you very much for joining me tonight. And join me again next Thursday at 9 p.m. Eastern for another episode on racism. And I think I will talk about it's about class, not race. Please share this video. Please follow us on YouTube. Please make sure that you subscribe to our YouTube channel. And please check out our Patreon account, because in Luqman Nation, we're trying to do a lot of good work, bringing education in a lot of different ways to a lot of different people. My name is Jacqueline Luqman. This has been Brick by Brick. Have a good night.
Building it brick by brick.